So now we're going to look at the military aspects of the war. So, December 7th, 1941, Japan secretly, deceitfully bombed Pearl Harbor. American anger was unprecedented towards the Japanese. They had brought us into the war. They had done this in such a dastardly way. So, of course, which nation would we go after first? And the answer was Germany. Now, I want you to think to yourselves, what were the two reasons that we felt we had to defeat Germany first, that we had to devote the bulk of our resources towards the European theater? One reason was Germany was a lot closer than Japan. Europe was a lot closer than Asia. Most of our economic ties with the rest of the world led uh, towards Europe, not towards Asia. And the second one was that we were much more fearful of German scientists and engineers than we were of the Japanese. The Germans developed some incredible stuff during the war, including jet aircraft at the end of the war. Uh, they developed rockets that hit England at the end of the war. And most importantly, they were working on the bomb. Most nations were working on the bomb, but we thought the Germans probably had the best chance of getting there before we did. So Germany had to be defeated first, which is why about 2/3 of our men and resources were devoted to the European theater. So that is where we will start. In Europe, well, in the Mediterranean, as you will see, our first action was not exactly in Europe. Here's the map of the German Empire at the peak of its expansion, and that included a massive chunk of Western Russia. They got to the suburbs, I guess you could say, of Moscow, and into the streets of a city called Stalingrad in 1942. But some people think that they actually took too much too quickly and had very difficult time defending all of that because of their resources being spread so thinly. The turning point in the war is often identified as the fall of 1942 for a variety of reasons. One was that the tide turned in the Battle of the Atlantic. And what I mean by that is, as I said, I think in the last presentation, that was the time in the war when our shipyards began to produce ships faster than the German U-boats could sink them. And that was due to both we were producing more and also that their U-boat warfare became increasingly ineffective as we developed new technology like sonar, new techniques to try to find the German submarines. And eventually, to be in a German subcrew was about as dangerous as to be in a B-17 bomber crew. So that was one factor. The second thing that began to happen in the fall of 42 was we began strategic bombing of Germany with our long-range bombers. At first, they didn't have fighter escort, which is why, as I mentioned before, it was such a dangerous thing to be in a bomber crew going over Germany. We did this for two reasons. We tried to destroy their military production facilities, but we also wanted them to pull their aircraft back into Germany to defend their homeland rather than have the ability of using their aircraft against, well, mainly England. And we also were planning long range that when the invasion of France came, we did not want France defended by German aircraft. And on D-Day, there might have been one or two German planes in the air on D-Day. That worked very, very effectively. Late fall of 42 was our first invasion, and that took place on North Africa. And we invaded this part of North Africa because these were French colonies. Now, France had been defeated by the Germans, but the Germans assigned the French army the defense of their former colonies. And we thought that this French army might not fight that hard if, you know, a lot of them we figured just didn't like the Germans, didn't like being under German authority. And it turned out to be true. Some of them didn't fight very hard. Some of them did. But this was a good way, a good place to get the American army into action for the first time, because we were by and large untested. And so we had some success. Now, after we liberated Morocco and Algeria, then we had to face the German army in North Africa and Tunisia. And at first that didn't go very well, but it was a learning experience, and we did get better. But the real turning point in the European theater of World War II did not have anything to do with the United States or Britain. It was the Battle of Stalingrad that, as you can see there, took about 6 months and left that city just a pile of rubble. And once those two armies got engaged, neither could disengage without surrendering tremendous advantage and pretty much being put on the defensive. The city itself had no strategic value. It's often said that the two sides fought over it because the city was named after Stalin, the Soviet leader. But once they got into that city, neither could give it up. And in the end, the Soviet army won. And from that point on, the Germans were on the defensive. Now, it would take a little over 2 years for the Soviet Union to finally get into the streets of Berlin. And it was a terrible, terrible fight on the Eastern Front. The Soviet Union faced, during most of the war, about 70% of the German army, which is why they think that, they won the war. And they do have a claim to having had a huge impact on the way that went. But from the early part of 1943 to the end of the war, the Soviet Union was on the offensive. After North Africa, the next decision was, should we go after France, which is what a lot of the American leaders wanted to do, or someplace else in the Mediterranean, which is what the British wanted, because they had a lot more interest in the Mediterranean world. They had some colonial possessions down there. And the British prevailed in this decision in 1943. And so the summer of 1943, we invaded Sicily. And at that point, everyone knew that an invasion of France could not take place that year. And it wasn't because we didn't have enough troops or enough rifles or tanks. It was those boats, those Higgins boats. We did not have enough Higgins boats to launch an invasion down in the Mediterranean and an invasion of Normandy at the same time. So Sicily it was, followed later in the fall by Italy. A terrible, terrible campaign that really, in the end, did very little to bring about the defeat of Germany any quicker. Costly, frustrating. We made very, very little progress until almost the very end of the war. What we did do was we brought down Mussolini. Okay, so the Italians themselves overthrew Mussolini and installed the new government, which promptly surrendered to the Americans and the British. But the Germans simply took over the war, and they were a better army anyway than the Italian army. Sorry about that, Greg. The photograph in the upper left is Mussolini and his girlfriend after some anti-Mussolini people found them in a village in northern Italy. And they killed them, hung them upside down in the center of the village, and left them there for a few days. People apparently were walking by, spitting on them and watching their bodies rot. Obviously, the big event in the European theater for the American forces was the invasion of Normandy, June 6, 1944. And the success of this invasion was due to a lot of things. Simply the number of men and material we had. There was tremendous courage on that day, but a lot of it was due to deception. We were trying to convince the Germans that we were going to come at a place called Calais, which is across from Dover at the narrowest point of the English Channel. And we did all kinds of things to convince them of that. First of all, when we did bombing of that part of France to get ready for the invasion. We spent a lot of time bombing the Calais area, even though we weren't going to invade there. We didn't want to let them know exactly where our intended target was. A lot of communication, fake communication, talking about Calais. A lot of paperwork that we hoped that they would intercept. But here was the most interesting thing. We had military bases around Dover, which again across the English Channel from Calais, filled with fake weapons. So you see that plane at the top. That's not a real plane. That's a bunch of plywood covered by canvas. That can't fly. But from the sky, when the German scout planes would come over, an airfield filled with those things looked like an airfield filled with warplanes. And we also had fields full of tanks, except they were really balloons. You see that photograph at the bottom, and a bunch of guys holding up what is supposed to be a Sherman tank. Those are either the strongest men in the history of the universe, or that's not really a tank. And the answer was the second one. So on D-Day, the Germans were fooled, and Hitler, it is said, he did not move the tanks away from Calais for a week. He thought, even after he heard the news that the Normandy invasion had begun, that was a fake, that the real invasion was still coming at Calais. And then after about a week, he said to himself, well, maybe not. I guess I better start moving those panzer divisions down to Normandy. A terrible time, obviously. I think a lot of you have seen the movie Saving Private Ryan. Another decision we made is we wanted to come in at low tide. The Germans thought we would come in at high tide. That way, get our boats as close as possible to the beach. And therefore, high tide would be a particular time of the day in the summer months. By coming in at low tide, we deceived them by 2 weeks, if you know anything about the way the tides work, based on the lunar calendar. Now, the reason we wanted to come in at low tide is because we knew that the water around the beaches was full of obstacles that the Germans had built. You know, the metal and the wooden obstacles, again, that you see in Saving Private Ryan. You can see them in that photograph a little bit. And they were designed to rip out the bottoms of the landing craft. Well, we wanted to be able to see them so they wouldn't rip out the bottoms. And so a lot of the guys who got off that first wave of landing craft were engineers whose sole task was to blow those things up so that when the water did come up, start rising with the tide coming in, that the next wave would not have the bottoms ripped out. And it worked. It was a terrible day. And if you've seen Saving Private Ryan, you know that first 26 minutes is a tough thing to watch. But think that on that actual day, what you saw in that movie went on for about 6 hours. After we won the Battle of Normandy, the next stop was liberating Paris. The Germans made the decision, sort of a triple tier defensive strategy. First tier was they were going to try to keep us from getting off the beaches at Normandy. Omaha Beach, they almost succeeded. But that didn't work. So then the second part of the strategy was to keep us bottled up in Normandy. And that worked for about 2 months. But after that, they just hightailed it back to Germany. There was one attempt at a counterattack, and that was the December counteroffensive that led to something called the Battle of the Bulge, which had us at our heels for a few weeks. But ultimately, the weather got better, the skies cleared, our Air Force got back in the air, we counterattacked, and it just delayed the inevitable for Germany by a few weeks. There are some soldiers crossing the German defensive barrier at the Siegfried Line in the spring of 45, with us coming and the British coming from the west, the Russians coming from the east. They were trying to fight two enemies at once. And I always love this picture. This is the German soldiers marching west towards prisoner of war camps in France. And meanwhile, that's the Autobahn, the famous German highway. Just day after day after day of nothing but American vehicles coming down that road. And those soldiers, they said that they just could not believe how much stuff was coming down the road into Germany that they were supposed to be fighting against. And so Hitler killed himself at the end of April, and the surrender was on May 7th.